He thought she was just another black woman he could push around until she stepped into that courtroom and dismantled his entire career. The highway stretched endlessly under the moon's silver glow, the Texas night thick with heat and secrets. Headlights from passing cars carved through the darkness, fleeting streaks of light against the vast emptiness. It was late, just past 11 p.m., a time when most had already settled in for the night, lost in dreams or the quiet hum of their homes. Major Elise Carter had been driving for nearly 2 hours, her fingers drumming absent-mindedly against the steering wheel, matching the slow rhythm of a blues tune humming through the radio. She wasn't in uniform tonight, just a navy blue sweater and a pair of well-worn jeans, her hair neatly pinned back. To the world outside, she was just another traveler on the road. Or so she believed, because someone was watching. And before the night was over, everything was about to change. Then she saw them red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror, closing in fast. Her stomach tightened, not in fear, but in sheer frustration. She had been here before. She knew exactly how this was going to play out. Sighing, Elise flicked on her signal, changed lanes, and pulled onto the shoulder. The car rolled to a stop. She shifted into park, took a slow, measured breath, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, visible, steady. Years in the military had taught her the drill. This wasn't about right or wrong. It never was. A white patrol car rolled to a stop behind her, its engine humming low against the quiet of the highway. The officer inside didn't move right away. Instead, he let the moment stretch, as if letting the weight of his presence settle before making his next move. When he finally stepped out, he did so with slow, deliberate purpose, heavy boots grinding against the asphalt, one hand resting on his duty belt, the other gripping a flashlight that clicked on with a sharp snap. Elise turned her head slightly, tracking his approach through the side mirror. The light caught the name on his badge. Morrison, license and registration. No greeting, no explanation, just a flat, clipped tone, rehearsed and impatient. Elise met his gaze in the mirror, then moved deliberately slow, precise, reaching into the glove compartment. She pulled out the documents and extended them toward him. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, voice even. Morrison didn't answer immediately. He took the papers, but instead of looking at them, his eyes roamed over her car, scanning. "Tail lights out," he said. She frowned. "That can't be right." Morrison's gaze finally landed on her, cold and measuring. "Are you arguing with me?" A beat of silence. Elise had seen this moment before, that brief, unspoken shift where authority met defiance, and one side was expected to fold. She had seen it in overseas operations, in briefing rooms filled with ranking officers, in every situation where control was the currency of power. She knew better than to escalate, but she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied, keeping her tone measured. "My tail lights were checked a few weeks ago. But if there's an issue, I'll have it fixed. Step out of the car." Morrison cut her off like he hadn't heard a word she said. Elise exhaled slowly. She cast a glance toward the road ahead, watching the blur of headlights slicing through the night. No witnesses. Elise tapped her fingers lightly against the steering wheel. Once, twice. Then she reached for the door handle. "Mind telling me why?" she asked. Morrison tilted his head slightly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Because I said so." She let the words settle between them. Then, unbuckling her seatbelt, she pushed the door open. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of hot pavement and pine. Elise stepped out, her stance relaxed but deliberate. She wasn't looking for trouble, but she wasn't about to be steamrolled either. Morrison took a slow step back, his gaze running over her like he was taking inventory. She could feel the calculation in his stare, measuring, deciding just how much he could push. "Turn around," hands on the car. This time, she hesitated. "For what reason?" Morrison's smirk faded. He stepped in closer, his presence pressing in like a tightening noose. "Are you resisting?" Elise didn't flinch. "No, I'm asking a question." A flicker of something passed over his face, annoyance, amusement, maybe both. Then, without warning, his fingers moved to his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the speaker. Then louder, "Turn around." Elise's pulse quickened, but her face remained unreadable. "Officer, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice even, steady. "I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do." Morrison didn't like that. His jaw tightened. "You're under arrest," he snapped, reaching for her wrist. Elise stepped back just enough to stay out of his reach, controlled, calculated. "Under arrest? For what?" Morrison pulled out his cuffs, metal catching the glare of the headlights. "For obstructing an officer." Elise exhaled slowly through her nose. So that was his game. Her military training kicked in, heartbeat steady, breathing controlled. She had two choices: comply and fight this later, or push back and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become another headline. With slow, deliberate movements, Elise turned, pressing her palms flat against the cool metal of her car's roof. Morrison didn't waste a second. He wrenched her arms behind her back, snapping the cuffs onto tight before shoving her forward. "You have no idea what you're doing," she murmured. Morrison chuckled, steering her toward his patrol car. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't, not even close. The hard plastic seat dug into her back as she sat still, wrists burning against steel, breath measured. The door slammed shut behind her, locking her in. Outside, Morrison swaggered back to his cruiser, muttering something into his radio. Elise stared at the plexiglass partition in front of her, catching a faint reflection of her own face, calm, unreadable. But underneath, something simmered. She had been through high-stakes operations, hostage negotiations, and interrogations overseas. But this was different. This was a man with a badge, drunk on power, convinced he was untouchable. Minutes passed, 5, then 10. She shifted slightly, testing the cuffs. Too tight. He had done it on purpose. The driver's side door swung open, and Morrison slid in, whistling a low tune. Well, he muttered, clicking his seatbelt into place. "Let's go for a little ride." Elise didn't react. The patrol car rumbled back onto the highway, red and blue lights flashing in the side mirrors, staining the road behind them. "You know," Morrison said after a moment, his tone almost conversational, "most people just do what I say and keep their mouths shut." Elise exhaled sharply through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Morrison chuckled, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She met his eyes through the glass. "I don't think I know." That made him pause, just for a second. His knuckles flexed around the wheel, a flicker of irritation flashing across his face, before he buried it under that same smug mask. "You military?" he asked, his tone shifting, curious, almost casual. She didn't answer. "Yeah," he muttered, nodding to himself. "Figured, you got that attitude. That above-the-law type." He smirked. "But you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" Still, she stayed silent. Morrison clicked his tongue. "Shame," he mused, shaking his head. "If you just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Her jaw tensed, the audacity, as if his actions were somehow her fault. Up ahead, the station came into view, a squat, gray concrete building just off the highway. A few dimly lit street lamps cast long shadows over the near-empty parking lot. Late-night processing was slow, and for now, it looked like she was the only guest. Morrison pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, cut the engine, and turned, looking at her through the partition. "Gotta say," Morrison murmured, "I do love when they make it easy." Before Elise could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A second later, her door swung open. "Let's go," he ordered. Elise stepped out, twisting her wrists slightly as she moved. The cuffs bit into her skin. He hadn't loosened them in the slightest. She kept her head high as he led her inside, past a tired-looking desk sergeant who barely glanced up. The processing area smelled like stale coffee and old sweat. A metal bench lined the far wall, a heavy steel door leading to the holding cells beyond it. Morrison uncuffed her just long enough to push her through the system. Fingerprints, mug shot, the whole routine. The officers behind the desk barely spared her a glance, just another name in the system. Just another late-night booking. She had seen this kind of indifference before. It was the kind that let men like Morrison thrive. When it was done, he grabbed her wrist again, steering her toward the cells. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath. Elise glanced sideways. "I don't have to think." His grip tightened. She knew that got under his skin. "Enjoy your stay," Morrison sneered, shoving her toward the open cell. Elise caught herself before she stumbled. Slowly, she turned to face him, watching as the metal bars slid shut between them. Morrison smirked from the other side, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before strolling away. The lock clicked into place. She exhaled, then sank onto the metal bench. The cold pressed through her jeans, grounding her. One night, that's all it would take. Because Morrison had no idea who he had just messed with. Elise shifted slightly, rolling her shoulders to work out the stiffness settling in. The cell wasn't much for walls, a dim, flickering light, and the lingering scent of old sweat and industrial disinfectant. She had spent nights in worse places, places where the danger wasn't just discomfort, it was life or death. This was nothing, but that didn't mean she wasn't angry. Through the bars, she could hear the low murmur of officers talking at the front desk. The shuffle of paperwork, the hollow clink of a coffee cup meeting a desk. She exhaled, slow, measured. Control the breathing, control the mind. It was muscle memory by now, drilled into her long before she had ever set foot in a war zone. Then heavy footsteps. She knew who it was before she even saw him. Morrison, that same arrogant stride, that same entitled rhythm. Like a man who believed the world owed him something. A second later, he was in front of the cell, arms crossed over his chest, that smug grin still plastered across his face. "Comfy," she didn't respond. He tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars. "You know, if you just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." A slow smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." For the first time, Morrison hesitated. Just a flicker of something in his eyes, irritation, maybe even doubt. But he masked it fast, scoffing as he glanced toward the empty holding area. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady," he said with a lazy shrug. "Guess that means you'll have plenty of time to think about that attitude." Elise just watched him, unmoved, unshaken. Morrison leaned in slightly. "See, here's the thing," he said, lowering his voice. "People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get out of trouble." She let him talk, let him ramble. It didn't matter. Because he had no idea what was coming. And then, right on cue, another officer appeared from the hallway, younger. Maybe late 20s, standard issue uniform, clipboard in hand. He stopped a few feet away, shifting slightly before speaking. Sergeant ... The officer's voice carried a note of hesitation. "We got a call." Morrison barely spared him a glance. The officer hesitated, shifting on his feet. "And ... I think you need to see this." Morrison frowned, then shot Elise one last look before stepping away. She sat back listening. The conversation was hushed, but she caught bits and pieces. Something about a lawyer, a call from higher up. Questions about why she was being held. Morrison's voice dipped lower, sharp, irritated. The younger officer stammered something in response, but whatever it was, it didn't sit well. Then those same heavy footsteps. Morrison stormed back, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. His smirk was gone. "What the hell did you do?" Elise leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, and smiled. "I didn't do anything." Elise tilted her head slightly. "But people talk, and some of us have friends in very high places." Morrison's face darkened. She could see it now, that moment of realization creeping in. The shift in power. He wasn't in control anymore. His jaw tightened, and he turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath before disappearing down the hallway. Elise exhaled, It wouldn't be long now. And when the truth came out, Morrison was going to regret every single decision that led him here. Morning light streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long streaks across the polished floors. The air inside was crisp, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones if you sat still too long. Elise stood near the defendant's table. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes sharp. She wasn't in handcuffs anymore. No orange jumpsuit, no holding cell. Just a well-tailored navy blue blazer, a crisp blouse, and an undeniable presence. She wasn't alone. Beside her, her attorney, Carla Whitman, flipped through a stack of documents, barely glancing up as people trickled into the courtroom. Efficient, methodical, no wasted movements, no small talk. Elise liked that, then. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Morrison walked in. He still walked like he owned the room, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to feign confidence. But there was a difference now, a stiffness in his step, a flicker of something in his expression that hadn't been there before. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. Elise caught his eye. He looked away. Good. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Judge Alan Kirkland, an older man with a weary expression and deep-set lines of experience, adjusted his glasses as he settled in. He didn't waste time. All right, he sighed, flipping open the case files. Let's get to it. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and a sharp gaze, cleared his throat. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Major Elise Carter, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new evidence suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Matthew Morrison. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Morrison shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The judge peered over his glasses, fixing him with a sharp look. Sergeant Morrison, care to explain? Morrison leaned forward, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. The prosecutor didn't let him finish. Uncooperative? He turned, lifting a document from the table. Major Carter's record shows a distinguished military career. Graduate of West Point, multiple commendations. No criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that, despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken tail light? Morrison opened his mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched. The prosecutor continued, flipping through his papers. Additionally, an internal review of your arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Morrison's face darkened. Judge Kirkland set his file down with a heavy sigh. Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing. Morrison leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest. She resisted. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. The body cam footage says otherwise. Another ripple of noise moved through the courtroom. Morrison glanced at the judge, a flicker of unease creeping into his posture. I was following standard procedure. Judge Kirkland didn't look convinced. His gaze shifted toward the bailiff. Let's play the footage. A screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. The video began to play. Elise didn't turn to watch. She had lived it. Morrison barking orders. Her calm, steady voice, the unnecessary escalation. The smug way he tightened the cuffs. The courtroom was dead silent when the footage ended. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Sergeant Morrison, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement. Morrison opened his mouth, but the judge wasn't done. The charges against Major Carter are hereby dismissed. His gavel came down sharp, final. And I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Morrison's conduct. The tension in the room snapped like a stretched rubber band. Morrison looked like he had been punched in the gut, his face flushed red, hands clenched into fists at his sides. Elise simply exhaled, slow, controlled. She never had a doubt. As she stood, gathering her things, she glanced toward Morrison one last time. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. Because this time, she wasn't the one who had to fight for her reputation. Morrison was. He stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing through the polished hallways. His face was tight, his jaw locked, and he could feel the eyes on him, other officers, court staff, even reporters who had shown up once word of the case spread. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control walking into a room and commanding respect, or fear, but now, the power he had taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. And then came the worst part, Sergeant Morrison. A sharp voice cut through the hallway noise. He turned. Chief Eldon Baker stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. A man with over 30 years on the force, respected, feared when necessary. His word carried weight. Morrison straightened. "Sir." Baker studied him for a long moment, then with a curt nod motioned for Morrison to follow him into a private office. The second the door shut, the chief's tone dropped. "What the hell were you thinking?" Morrison exhaled sharply. "I was doing my job. Your job." Baker scoffed, tossing a file onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. "That's not what it looks like from here. The body cam footage, the arrest history. The fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting." Morrison's nostrils flared. "What does that have to do with anything?" Baker leaned forward. "Everything." His voice was quiet, but sharp. "This wasn't some one-off mistake, Morrison. You've been flagged for racial profiling. And you better believe this department isn't going down with you." Morrison felt his stomach twist. "What does that mean?" Baker straightened, his face unreadable. "It means you're being put on immediate suspension, effective now. Internal Affairs is investigating, and if they find what I think they're gonna find ... He shook his head. "Your career is over." The words hit Morrison like a punch to the gut. His face burned. "This is bull." Baker held up a hand. "Don't finish that sentence." His voice was ice. Morrison clenched his jaw shut. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Across the city, Elise sat in a quiet cafe, her coffee warm between her hands. She had known the moment she stepped out of her car that night how this would go. She had seen men like Morrison before, entitled, arrogant, used to bending the law in their favor. But this time, he lost. Elise's phone buzzed. A message from her attorney. "Morrison has been suspended, might face charges." She took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Cars weaved through traffic. Pedestrians hurried past, caught up in their own routines. The world moved on. But the fight wasn't over, not for her. Not for the people Morrison had likely hurt before. But today was a win. The crisp afternoon air filtered through the open cafe window. No signs of defeat, no cracks in her composure. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a call. She picked up. Major Carter. A familiar voice greeted her. It was the captain. "You did everything by the book," he said. No one could have handled it better. Elise stared out the window, watching the steady rhythm of the city. "I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do," she replied. The captain's voice softened. "That's what I thought you'd say." A pause. "The Department of Defense is taking an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it." Elise exhaled through her nose. "Not sure I'm interested in being a headline." "You already are," the captain countered. "And whether you like it or not, what happened to you is part of something bigger. This won't be the last." "No," the captain agreed. "But it's the first time Morrison is facing consequences. And it's because you didn't back down." Elise closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words settle. She didn't back down. Not when Morrison pulled her over. Not when he tried to intimidate her. Not when the cuffs cut into her wrists. Not even when she spent the night behind bars, knowing full well the deck had been stacked against her. She had stayed firm. And now she had won. The captain cleared his throat. "You did good, Carter." Outside, laughter rang out bright, carefree. Elise turned toward the sound. A young boy, no older than 10, raced down the sidewalk, his sneakers slapping against the pavement. His world was light, untouched by fear. For now, she watched him for a moment. The next generation, she had fought for herself, yes. But she had also fought for him, for every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Morrison couldn't wield their badges like weapons. She took a deep breath, and then she walked away. Her steps firm, her purpose clear. Because this fight wasn't just hers, it never had been. Power, unchecked, is power abused. And the only way to stop it is to fight back.